Welcome to Just Relationships, the show that offers you concrete ways to make your relationships better. Whether it's your boss, your spouse, your children, or your friends, the quality of your relationships in life directly affects how you feel about yourself and the success you achieve. Your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer, a psychotherapist, telecoach, author, and seminar leader, will interview top experts to help you learn to manage this essential part of your life. And now, here's your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer.
Greetings to you. We're looking today at a disease, a dis-ease called Alzheimer's that people have in great proportions in our society. And it's a very, very frightening thing. We live much longer, and many people think, well, maybe Alzheimer's is inevitable and there's nothing I can do about it. And even worse, once I get it or start to get it, I'm doomed. Well, I am so honored and pleased to have as my guest Dr. Dale Bredesen, who wrote the book, The End of Alzheimer's, the first program to prevent and reverse cognitive decline. And Dr. Bredesen, I have seen you on television a number of times, and I want everyone to know that we are live streamed and that we are the only not-for-profit public radio on iHeartRadio, so that a lot of people are going to get to listen to this show. So welcome, Dr. Bredesen.
Thanks very much, Dr. Duffy.
So tell us what we can do to prevent Alzheimer's to begin with. What is your breakthrough work? Your very experimental breakthrough work.
Yeah, so first of all, as you know, this is a major problem now, and in fact, it's been shown now to be the third leading cause of death in the United States after cardiovascular disease and cancer. And actually, dementia is now the number one cause of death in the United Kingdom. So this is a huge and growing problem. And we've been told over the years that there's nothing you can do to prevent or reverse or delay this disease. We have worked in the lab, as you indicated, for over 30 years now to ask that simple question: how does this disease work? Can we understand it at a fundamental enough level that we can fashion the first effective treatments? And in the book that you mentioned, we did talk about the breakthrough to understand what is actually causing this problem. And in fact, there is a tremendous amount that you can do. The reality is very few people should get this disease. It should literally be a rare disease. But unfortunately, things that we're doing, and literally it should almost end with the current generation. That's the reality. We recommend, therefore, that people get checked out. What we call Alzheimer's disease has turned out to be, as a surprise, a protective response that your brain makes to a number of different insults. For example, anything that causes you chronic inflammation. If you have a leaky gut, as an example, if you have trans fats that you're eating, if you have exposure to Borrelia of Lyme disease, Bartonella, Babesia, oral microbiome agents like P. gingivalis. You probably heard recently about the herpes studies. All of these different things can infect people and actually can go unrecognized. And what your brain does to protect itself is to produce the amyloid, the stuff that we associate with Alzheimer's disease. So anything that's inflammatory. And then secondly, anything that causes chronic elevations in your insulin, what we call insulin resistance. So the standard American diet, gaining weight, having processed foods, all of these sorts of things. In fact, there's a chapter in the book on how to give yourself Alzheimer's. So if you ever want to know how to give yourself Alzheimer's, chapter 4 tells you. And so you can read to see, look, these are the things. And unfortunately, as you know, Dr. Duffy, so many of us are doing the very things that put us at risk for Alzheimer's today. And then, of course, there are all sorts of things related to nutrients. If you are low on specific hormones, specific trophic factors that support your brain, or specific nutrients, things like vitamin D, you are putting yourself at risk for cognitive decline. And then toxins, things that we hadn't recognized before. Metals, of course, you've heard about mercury before. Also organic toxins like DDE, and then also biotoxins like mycotoxins, which are actually produced by molds that are in your house or in your place of work when you have water leaks. So, in fact, all of these things conspire to contribute to this problem. And typically what we find is that people have between 10 and 25 different contributors. So when I wrote the first paper in 2014 that actually showed for the first time that this problem could be reversed, then we recognized that, in fact, there are these subtypes of it, and in fact, you can see many different contributors. So that's why we recommend everybody over 45 get what we call a cognoscopy. Just like you get a colonoscopy when you're 50, get a cognoscopy when you're 45 or over, and check to see where you stand.
And how do you do that, Dr. Bredesen, get a cognoscopy?
Yeah, it's simple. You can actually get it online now. Simple online screening test, and it's also some blood work. You can look it up. In fact, you can look it up, for example, on mycognoscopy.com, and you can look to see how to get that. It's some blood tests. So you think about it very much the way you think about heart disease. 100 years ago, people didn't know about heart disease related to cholesterol and now LDL particle number and things like that. They didn't get lipid profiles. Then later they said, hey, wait a minute, we can get these lipid profiles and we can actually determine who's at risk and who's at lower risk. And of course, as you know, they're getting better and better and better as we understand more about what actually contributes. We understand more about the inflammation piece there. We understand more about the oxidized LDL and things like that. Well, the same thing happens with the brain. It's a little more complicated with the brain, of course. There are more factors, but the idea is very much the same. You want to know if your brain is being insulted in a way that you are going to respond, defend yourself by putting down this amyloid. And more think of amyloid the way you would think of napalm. If you've got the bad guys breaching your borders, you're trying to fight them. That's exactly what your brain is doing. It's putting down this stuff that is antimicrobial, but in so doing, it is decreasing the amount of arable soil. In other words, decreasing your neural network. And that happens over years. And so if you've got a continued exposure to these same problems, and often you don't know it and your doctor doesn't know it, what's happening is you are downsizing over the years. And ultimately, you get what we call Alzheimer's disease.
And are amyloids in the form of creating plaque in the brain, that the plaque is protective?
So what happens is that, yes, the plaques have mostly amyloid. They have other things in the plaques as well, but a lot of it is made up of this amyloid. And yes, and the amyloid is in a couple of different forms. And as an example, when it is a few of the amyloids together, that's essentially the fighting force. Those are the oligomers, as they're called, and they're the ones that are the antimicrobials. Then when they're all together as the plaques you mentioned, that's more like having soldiers in a fort. They're not actively fighting. They're essentially in storage, but they can come out if needed. So, yes, we look at the brain and we say, oh, my gosh, there are these plaques. This person had Alzheimer's disease. Well, what it tells us, this person was actually being insulted by these different factors and was therefore producing stuff to fight these things. And in so doing, was literally downsizing their network. So that, again, you can evaluate all the different things, which is what we do, look and see why they are under attack, and then you can actually fashion programs, and these are computer-based algorithms we use to give personalized programs so that for each person you can say, okay, again, just the way your cardiologist would say, you've got to change your lifestyle, you've got to do this and that. You would think your cardiologist wasn't very good if he or she said to you, well, cut out the cheeseburgers, but leave the French fries and the Cokes, and things like that. You say, well, what kind of a cardiologist are you? Well, the same thing happens with the brain. You want to address all of the different contributors to your cognitive decline.
Wow. Okay, so thank you for the very practical idea of getting a cognoscopy, and it's mycognoscopy.com. And what is in people's control, Dr. Bredesen? Certainly we can check for water leaks. Certainly we can check for what on earth we eat and don't eat. So you're so brilliant, and and I don't have a medical background, so what you're explaining, I only understand a little bit. What can you tell people when you say about the fatty acids and the leaky gut and chronic inflammation and insulin resistance? So what can people do tomorrow?
So the good news is you can address all of these things, and we'll go through it in the book and all the different pieces. But we can break it down simply into 4 different pieces, and these are based on the different subtypes. We found that there are 4 different subtypes of Alzheimer's disease. So number 1 is what we call inflammatory or hot. This is people who have ongoing inflammation. So for those people, we want to know, why do you have ongoing inflammation? And I should mention, by the way, that for people, we're talking now about people with risk for cognitive decline or cognitive decline, but these same principles apply to all of us to improve our cognition. All of us can enhance our cognition by addressing these same sorts of things. So how do you do that? As you said, practically speaking, number 1, find out if you have ongoing inflammation. Very simple. Get an HSCRP. It's a simple blood test. See if it's above 1.0, which suggests systemic inflammation. Then see if you've got specific pathogens that are associated. Find out if you have a leaky gut. You can talk to your doctor about that. It's relatively easy to do. And if you do, it can be fixed. There are many people who have healed their leaky guts, and there are certainly books about that and online resources. So that's easy to do. Then the second part is find out if you have insulin resistance. Again, easy to do, and it's a very common problem in our Western society. Find out what your fasting insulin is. So fasting insulin, good thing to know for all of us. And I usually start out, when I lecture, I usually say to people, okay, how many people in the audience want to avoid Alzheimer's? And of course, everybody puts their hand up. Mm-hmm. And then I say, okay, how many people know they're fasting insulin? And nobody puts their hands up. Well, if you want to avoid Alzheimer's, you should know your fasting insulin. And you should also know your HSCRP. You should know these basics just as you know your lipid panel or your cholesterol. Very, very important for your brain. So, you want to know your fasting insulin. It's an easy thing to get. I think a lot of people know their hemoglobin A1C. That's also related to insulin toxicity. And what happens in the brain is this. Insulin is a very important trophic factor. What that means is it's literally supporting your brain and the making and keeping of the connections that you call synapses in the brain. This literally the making and keeping of your memories. Now, when you eat lots of carbohydrates, and especially simple carbohydrates and sugar and things like that, which essentially our bodies were not designed to eat the amounts of simple carbohydrates that we are now exposed to. As you're well aware, 100 years ago, people were not eating anything close to the carbs. And I'm as guilty of this as any. I didn't know when I was going to medical school how important these different things were going to be. I had no idea. We weren't taught about this. Yes. But it has turned out that, in fact, it's very important. This is literally, we are living in a way that we were not evolutionarily designed to live. It's as if, each day for fun you would jump out of a third-story building. Well, that's going to hurt you. And that's exactly what happens when we're eating the way that we're now exposed to. Whether you're drinking sodas or whether you're eating things like processed foods that may have a lot of high fructose corn syrup and things like this. These are very, very damaging, literally poisonous to our own health. So what they do is they require you to make more insulin to keep up with all that